I'd like to invite Dahr now to the stage.
Let me do that one. I want to start, first of all, I was going to actually ask Eric to play the flute before I spoke, so and thank both of you for your reading and for your playing. You deserve to be on the biggest stage there is. Maureen, thank you so much. Maureen's a champion for all the work that you've done and keeping in touch over the years, and the support and asking me to be here. This has been a really, really great conference so far, and it's a privilege to be here. I also want to start with acknowledging that we are on indigenous land, and thank the indigenous people who lived here and were stewards of this land for thousands and thousands of years before first contact. Every time I give a talk now or a book reading, it's different. This talk keeps evolving itself and me as I go along, and that coupled with the fact that I want it to not be too redundant from what I talked about yesterday, since the brunt of the audience is the same. I'm going to go pretty far off script. So I don't know how coherent this will even be, so I thought maybe it'd be best to think of it more like a collage of ideas and sharings. The title of this book is The End of Ice, and it's the end of a project that I really started itself way back in '96, but then in the material world started itself probably around 2015. It took me all around the world to the front lines of where the climate crisis is the most severe, places like the Amazon and the Great Barrier Reef in South Florida for sea level rise, and glaciers in Alaska and Montana and Washington State, forests around the western U.S. and other places, and indigenous communities like Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska, to visit with the Inuit, and places like St. Paul Island and the Pribilofs to visit with the Anungan people there, also referred to as Aleutians. And this book, since it really the way it concludes, where I bring some very, very strong indigenous voices into the book that have informed my thinking and changed my life since I've met with some of them. There's a word that I want to introduce you to today, if you're not already familiar with it. It's a word that was brought to me by reading a man named Jack Forbes, he's passed away, but he was a Native American scholar, and he wrote many articles and books, but the book I'm talking about is called Columbus and Other Cannibals, and fantastic book, and it's a must read, and I want to just share with you a little bit about, I wrote about it to lead an article I wrote a little ways back called For Native Americans, History Continues to Repeat Itself. Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Native American Studies at University of California, Davis, Jack Forbes, writes in his book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, of what he calls the sickness of exploitation, or the Wetiko disease. Wetiko means cannibal. Cannibalism, as Forbes defines it, quote, is the consuming of another's life for one's own private purpose or profit, end quote. Forbes notes, quote, imperialism and exploitation are forms of cannibalism, and in fact are precisely those forms of cannibalism which are most diabolical or evil. Few, if any, societies on the face of the earth have ever been as avaricious, cruel, violent, and aggressive as have certain European populations, Forbes concludes. Native Americans experienced Huaytico in brutal fashion not long after first contact with Europeans. These are words from Harold Dick Jr., a 72-year-old Chiricahua Apache, who told me, Europeans slaughtered during one short period alone 50 million buffalo because thousands of us relied on them, and in less than a generation they annihilated them. And they take pride in this and take pictures of the dead buffalo, like it takes a real man to shoot an animal with a high-powered rifle from far away. Harold Dick Jr. added that when Native Americans talk about great people, they usually speak of medicine people. Quote, but all of the greats the whites ever write about were great at destruction and subjugating people. I could go on, you could read the article, but that gives you a taste of, I think, one of the foundational ideas under what I want to talk about today, which is Huaytico, because I, for a long time, would look at these people in power, not just at the moment, but over time, and understanding that the majority of them had children and or grandchildren, and how could they willingly go out engaging in policies, pushing through policies, knowing what they're doing to the planet, the wars, and then now everything that's caused the climate crisis. And when I came across Forbes's writing, that's when I understood. It's literally a pathology. It's literally a psychosis. And these people are literally mentally ill and deeply, deeply, deeply spiritually sick. And that's what really helped me understand now what's upon us. And that the end of ice, this is a book all about the climate crisis, mostly. But understanding now that this book is really just a symptom. It's about another symptom of Huaytico. And I believe that we are in the final stage of the Huaytico disease, where it's literally at a precipice now, possibly even bringing down life on Earth. When I started writing about the climate crisis in full back around 2010, I'd known it was happening, but got distracted away from it to write about things like the invasion of Iraq and then the BP oil spill. And then finally came back around to it in 2010 and started writing about it in earnest. In 2013, I wrote an article for Tommy Wilhart's great website, tomdispatch.com, and it was titled, Are we Already Off the Climate Precipice? And if you read the article, obviously the answer was yes. And in the article, I essentially pulled together a bunch of different scientists, and based on all the reporting I'd done in the 3 years leading up to that, it was clear to me, looking at what's happening to the ice, to feedback loops, to coral, to marine life, to this being in the sixth mass extinction already, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we were already indeed in a situation where feedback loops had been triggered by this runaway Huaytico disease now in the climate that are irreversible. And that is fact. And so I had what I've heard referred to as my fetal position moment, when all this came crashing down upon me, and I was working for Al Jazeera English in Doha, and literally laid on my couch for about 3 months. And I did my job, but when I wasn't doing that, I was laying on my couch, literally, wondering, what to do. And it was then really, I started another trip through the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Denial. I was in denial for a while about how far along we were. Anger. That's always a hard one to let go of. Bargaining. Maybe if we do this, it won't be as bad. Maybe if this legislation passes. Maybe if this political candidate. Maybe. But. Bargaining. Then depression. And then finally acceptance. And this book really for me was a gift because it took me through all those stages over and over, and getting to go to these frontline places with some of the leading scientists in each of those areas on the planet, literally, and then talking to them personally about how they dealt with it, and then really, it really kind of sped me along that process of getting into where I think I do spend a lot, probably the majority of the time, in acceptance now about what's happening. And I hope that you are able to get to spend more time in that place if you're not already there. And I think, but you know, a requisite of that is having a very, very clear idea of where we already are. And so, what I think I want to do is just now read some of the broad brushstrokes that I shared yesterday. Obviously with this audience, everybody understands we're in a climate crisis. It's why you're here at this conference. But I want to give just some of the brushstrokes to really underscore how far along we already are. 2018, last year, was the 4th warmest year ever recorded, with the only warmer years being 2015, 2016, and 2017. This June was the hottest June ever recorded since record keeping began. Last month, July, was the hottest July and the hottest month ever recorded in history. We're currently in the middle of what is on track to be the warmest decade, obviously, since record keeping began. As I mentioned, we are in the 6th mass extinction event that industrial civilization has caused. We're injecting CO2 into the atmosphere at a rate 10 times faster than what occurred during the Permian mass extinction event 252 million years ago that annihilated 90% of life on Earth. Our current extinction rate is 1,000 times faster than normal and is faster than that of the Permian mass extinction. But today, just like what I ran into during my reporting from Iraq, people they wanted to know the truth, but not really. So, for example, in Iraq, and this is going to get a bit graphic, most people on the left in this country, on the so-called left, were against the war for good reasons, for the right reasons, for the moral reasons. But when I started reporting about what U.S. soldiers were really doing, which is not really any different than what U.S. soldiers have always done since the original genocide, since we live in a country built on genocide and slavery. So the military has always been used by those in power to do their bidding. And so in Iraq, this was no different. People like to think, oh, there's been some sort of evolution and there's, things like war crimes and things like this. And of course, America being the shining house on the hill, our military would never do such things. They would never intentionally use snipers to target women, children, and elderly in Fallujah, which I saw firsthand. They would never intentionally use snipers to find young adolescent boys in Fallujah and shoot them in between their legs, repeatedly. They would never intentionally use white phosphorus in areas where they know that there's civilians. They would never intentionally use cluster bombs in an area where they know there's tens of thousands of civilians by their own admission at that time. They would never intentionally use depleted uranium, intentionally leaving places poisoned for generations and generations and generations. And some folks were, okay, I want to know what's going on. That's really, really hard to take in. It's extremely upsetting. But I think the majority of the people really didn't. Even a lot of the people that were against the war to begin with. And I think I've had a similar experience when we talk about Waitico disease and when we talk about now the climate crisis, which is, I think, one of the most severe symptoms yet, if not the most severe, of this disease. And so people like to kind of get into the bargaining phase that, oh, we still have 12 years left, according to the UN report that came out a year ago, which was bogus because no new information in that report whatsoever. Any scientist will tell you that well, not any, but the majority of scientists, at least that I've spoken with, and I'll come back to this, have said, no, we're way far off the cliff. These feedback loops are kicked in, and not geoengineering, not a Green New Deal, not a new political candidate, not anything that the system that's essentially now completely populated by people infected with Waitico disease is going to solve. And so each one of those things is an attempt to solve something by a system that created it that is now unsolvable. More statistics, the oceans have absorbed 93% of all the heat humans have added to the atmosphere. To give you an idea of how much energy that is, if they hadn't absorbed that heat, right now global atmospheric temperatures would be 97 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than they are right now. And they've absorbed half of that heat since just 1997. That's why now every single year for the last 5 years and counting is a record warm heat year for oceans. Today's carbon dioxide levels at 415 parts per million CO2 are already in accordance with what historically brought about a steady state planetary temperature of 4 to C degrees higher, depending on where you are on the planet. And that's in alignment with what several scientists have told me, that if we stop burning all CO2 emissions on a dime yesterday and did every mitigation measure available right now, that we're locked into a minimum of 3C warming. A minimum. Already insects, which are essential for the proper functioning of all of Earth's ecosystems, as they are food for other creatures, pollinators, and recyclers of nutrients, and without them, we will not survive. A series of studies in the last 9 months informs us that there will be no more insects within 100 years of the current trajectory, because we're losing 2.4% of insect biomass annually. And this is from insecticides, habitat loss, and of course, climate disruption. On top of that, since just 1970, 60% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles are gone. So, no surprise here, given what colonial settler mentality did to indigenous people and people of color in so many places around the globe. That's what's happening now to the animal and plant kingdom. So we call that genocide for humans. We would need to call it the same thing for other species as well. The IPCC's worst case temperature scenario increase projection by 2100 is between 4 and 5 degrees C. I've had more than one IPCC being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've had more than one IPCC author tell me you can take their worst case projections and double them. And it's because everyone who studies the IPCC, even those in it, understand deeply it's a heavily politicized organization, i.e. it's not science. Contrasted with that projection, the International Energy Agency, which essentially represents fossil fuel interests around the planet, has stated that preserving our current economic paradigm, i.e. Waitico, virtually guarantees a 6C rise in Earth's average temperature before 2050. Shell and BP analysts expect the globe to be as much as 5C warmer, also by mid-century. I want to just read briefly a couple of things from the book now. One voice I include in the conclusion of the book is from Stephen Jenkinson. He's a Canadian who is a storyteller, author, activist, and he's worked in the palliative care industry for decades. He doesn't anymore. He has a great book called Die Wise, which I highly recommend. But he gave a talk at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver a ways back, and during part of that talk, he discussed the climate crisis. And so I want to just read you what he said on that topic during that talk. The question is not, are we going to fail? The question is how. The question is, what shall be the manner of our inability to care for what was entrusted to us? The question is our manner of failing. He went on to say, grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are willing to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. On hope, I also want to read another quote that I shared yesterday from Czech dissident writer and statesman Václav Havel, who said, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out." I was working on the conclusion of the book, and I met a Native American elder, Stan Rushworth, of Cherokee descent, and I had to rewrite the last 10 pages of the book about a week before deadline. That's how much impact our conversations and some of the work together that we did had on me. And so I want to read a story that he shared with me from one of his elders. It's an old story that was told to him by Dr. Darrell Babe Wilson, who was born into the Pitt River Nation of northeastern California. Wilson tells of Misa, a small but powerful spirit that inhabits Akuyet, what white man named Mount Shasta, a very high volcano located in the southern end of the Cascade Range in north central California. Misa is a spirit force that balances the earth with the universe and the universe with the earth. Wilson says that Akuyet is, quote, the most necessary of all the mountains upon earth, for Misa keeps the earth a proper distance from the sun and keeps everything in its proper place when wonder and power stir the universe with a giant yet invisible canoe paddle. Misa keeps the earth from wandering away from the rest of the universe. It maintains the proper seasons and the proper atmosphere for life to flourish as Earth changes seasons on its journey around the sun, end quote. The mountain, the story tells us, must be worshipped because Misa dwells deep within it. To climb the mountain with a pure heart and with real resolve, and to communicate with, quote, all of the light and all of the darkness of the universe is to place your spirit in a direct line from the songs of Misa to the heart of the universe. While in this posture, the spirit of man/woman is in perfect balance and harmony, end quote. For as long as Misa's instructions are followed with sincerity, society will be sustained. Its inhabitants will survive for the long term. The most, quote, the most important of all the lessons, it is said, is to be so quiet in your being that you constantly hear the soft singing of Misa, end quote. However, the story also warns that by not listening to Misa's song, the song will fade. Misa will depart, quote, and the earth and all the societies upon earth will be out of balance, and life therein vulnerable to extinction. I think I want to read this next part too. In 1973, Wilson's elder, grandfather Craven Gibson, summoned Wilson to warn him of impending disaster. Gibson pointed to the moon and asked Wilson to see the scars and the, quote, injured land. Remember, these stories are meant to be metaphorical, not literal. He recounted a story told to him by his grandmother of a, quote, big war between the people that occurred there on the moon. Given the story told to Gibson by his grandmother dated to the mid-19th century, this locates it at the beginning of the genocide of Native Americans in California. Between 1846 and 1880, 90% of them were killed by white colonists, making the story a profound warning of colonialism's devastating impact on nature and the earth. Gibson's grandmother's story told of a terrible war between, quote, those people who did not care about life and did not care if the moon remained a dwelling place, and those others who wanted the moon to remain a good place to live. Grandfather Gibson stated clearly, that war used up the moon. When the moon caught fire, there wasn't even enough water to put it out. It was all used up. The moon burned. It cooked everything. That huge fire cooked everything, just everything. Grandfather Gibson confessed to Wilson that he feared the earth could also be all used up if everyone failed to, quote, correct their manner of wasting resources and amend their arrogant disregard for all of life. So I'm going to read one more thing, and then we'll wrap this up. This is my way of trying to kind of fend off the usual obligation to leave people on an up note or tell you what to do. Rushworth, Stan teaches indigenous literature and critical thinking at Cabrillo College, a little community college in Aptos, California, just south of Santa Cruz. He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, and he has 2 books out in print, which should be mandatory reading for everyone. So I urge you to look those up and read them. But so I want to. He regularly brings people, usually indigenous elders, into his classes to talk to his students, and he especially brings them in so that the elders can talk to his students about what is it to have right relationship to Earth. And the students always ask the elders, according to Stan, what can we do? Henry Tyler, an Arapaho elder, would point a finger to his head and say nothing for a while. Stan said he would just stand there for several minutes. And then he would answer, use this, and smile. Quote, this is Stan, everything he'd said for the previous 3 hours would provide tools for those who chose to respond, Rushworth said. He gave so much to reflect upon that a finger to the head was a powerful statement. CeeLo Blackcrow, a Lakota Sundance leader and elder, would also smile and say, think about it. That's up to you. I can't tell you what to do. Educate yourself, then you decide. Of this, Stan added, like with Uncle Henry, listening to him for 3 hours would give an incalculable amount of information and food for reflection. End quote. The common message these men offer, Rushworth believes, is that each person must come fully into their own agency and from that place, decide upon their proper course of action. Otherwise, simply following the lead of someone else would entail a lack of the kind of conviction needed for these times. Another thing that Stan shared with me that helps me daily now is he pointed out the distinction between the settler colonialist mentality of rights, what are my rights, versus an indigenous perspective of what are my obligations. And he said for him, his primary obligations are to serve the planet, serve and take care of the planet, and to serve and take care of future generations of all species. And so if I get up each day and ask to be shown from inside and from all around me, how can I best fulfill those obligations? That's a good starting point for me. So I always share the Misa story because the part of the story where it says the most important part of the story is to listen, to be very, very quiet and listen, which flies in the face of Waitiko culture. People probably are used to having a lot of folks show up that just talk at you, try to tell you what to do. Nobody knows what to do right now. We're in the sixth mass extinction. We don't know for sure if humans are going to go extinct, but it's not looking good. We know that a lot of other species are already going extinct and have gone extinct. We now live in, I think, an overtly authoritarian state in this country. It's been authoritarian for a long time, but now the veil has dropped completely, and everyone can see it, not just minorities and poor people and other people on the other end of the gun. So I think it's time each one of us, including myself, has to be an adult and think for themselves and go listen very, very quietly to the earth and see what I'm going to hear. Because I realized when Stan shared that story with me that I got my message to go to Iraq and start reporting while I was on Denali in Alaska. And then I got the message to do this book also while I was in the mountains. It wasn't my idea, it came to me. It was given to me, and then I knew inside that's what I needed to do. And so my hope is to conclude that if each one of us goes to where our preferred place is to go listen to Misa, whether it's in the woods or rivers or oceans or lakes or mountains or wherever it may be, and if we get really quiet and really listen, then we're going to know what we need to do. Because the earth's running the show. It's not us, it's not a political party, it's not even humans. And so the earth needs to tell us what to do. The earth is telling us what to do. We need to listen. We need to listen. So let's listen, and then let's do what we're told. Thank you.